The crisp morning air filled Sarah Mitchell's lungs as she stepped out of her black Mercedes SUV at Atlanta International Airport. The early September sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. At 42 years old, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had earned every bit of success she enjoyed, though she never flaunted it. Today was supposed to be like any other day for the respected neurosurgeon. She was headed to Houston for an emergency surgery that only a handful of doctors in the country could perform. A young patient's life depended on her getting there on time. She checked her watch, 6:45 a.m. Perfect timing. Sarah adjusted her navy blue blazer and grabbed her designer briefcase from the passenger seat. Her natural hair was styled professionally, and her minimal makeup highlighted her confident features. 20 years of medical practice had taught her to always look presentable, no matter the hour. The private jet terminal stood ahead, its glass walls reflecting the morning light. As she walked toward the entrance, her heels clicked softly against the pavement. Several other travelers, mostly businessmen in expensive suits, made their way in and out of the terminal. A few nodded respectfully in her direction, recognizing the air of quiet confidence she carried. Inside her briefcase were all the necessary documents: her medical license, the charter flight details, hospital credentials, and the emergency surgery paperwork. Sarah had triple-checked everything before leaving home. After all, she had built her reputation on being thorough and prepared. Her mind wandered to her patient in Houston. 12-year-old Tommy Rodriguez had a rare brain tumor that was pressing against his brainstem. His parents had searched nationwide for someone who could help their son, and Sarah's name had come up as the best option. She had reviewed his case files late into the night and knew exactly what needed to be done. The private terminal was quieter than the main airport, one of the reasons Sarah preferred it. The soft hum of distant jet engines and the occasional announcement over the PA system created a peaceful atmosphere. The marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and comfortable leather chairs lined the waiting area. Sarah approached the security checkpoint, pulling out her identification. She had used this terminal dozens of times before for similar emergency cases. The familiar faces of the regular staff were nowhere to be seen today. Instead, a new security guard stood at the checkpoint, his name tag reading James Webster. Something about his posture changed the moment he saw her walking up. His back stiffened, and his eyes narrowed slightly. Sarah had seen that look before, too many times to count. It was the look of someone making quick, unfair judgments based solely on her appearance. She took a deep breath, remembering her father's words from years ago. "Your excellence is your armor, and your dignity is your sword." Those words had guided her through medical school, through her residency, and through countless situations just like this one. Sarah maintained her professional smile as she reached the checkpoint. In her hand, she held out her ID and flight documentation. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the gold embossing on her medical credentials, and her hospital chief of surgery badge gleamed prominently. "Good morning," she said warmly, her voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and politeness that she had mastered over the years. "I'm Dr. Mitchell, headed to Houston on the 7:30 charter flight." She could feel other travelers' eyes on her now. A young woman in a business suit had stopped to watch the interaction. Two pilots standing near the coffee machine paused their conversation. The air in the terminal seemed to grow thicker with tension. Security guard Webster's face twisted into what he probably thought was a stern expression, but Sarah could see right through it. She'd faced prejudice in 1,000 different forms throughout her career, from patients who demanded a different doctor, from nurses who'd questioned her authority, from administrators who'd overlooked her for promotions. But today was different. Today, a young boy's life hung in the balance, and Sarah knew that what happened next would matter not just to her, but to every person who might face similar discrimination in the future. She squared her shoulders, kept her smile firmly in place, and prepared herself for what was about to unfold. Little did security guard Webster know, his next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just his life, but the entire airport's approach to security and discrimination. Security guard Webster looked at Dr. Sarah Mitchell's credentials with exaggerated suspicion. He turned the documents over in his hands several times, holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. His actions were slow and deliberate, meant to make Sarah feel uncomfortable. "There must be some mistake," Webster said loudly, making sure others could hear him. This area is for private jet passengers only. His voice carried a tone that suggested he thought it was impossible for someone like Sarah to be in such a place. Sarah remained composed, though she was acutely aware of the time ticking by. It was now 6:55 a.m., and her flight was scheduled for 7:30. Tommy Rodriguez and his worried parents were waiting in Houston. "There's no mistake," Sarah replied calmly, pulling out additional documentation from her briefcase. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Chief of Neurosurgery at Atlanta Memorial. I have an emergency surgery scheduled in Houston this morning. Here's my charter flight confirmation, my hospital ID, and my medical license." Webster's face reddened slightly. He pushed the documents back across the counter without even looking at them. "Anyone can print fake papers these days," he said dismissively. "Maybe you got confused. The regular terminal is that way." He pointed toward the main airport building with a smirk. The small crowd watching the scene grew larger. A flight attendant stepped forward as if to say something, then stopped when her colleague pulled her back. An elderly businessman shook his head in disapproval, though it wasn't clear whether his disapproval was aimed at Webster or Sarah. "Mr. Webster," Sarah said, reading his name tag again, "I understand you're doing your job, but I've used this terminal many times before. I can have the hospital administrator call to confirm my identity. A young patient's life depends on my getting to Houston on time." Webster's response was to reach for his radio. "I might need backup here." He spoke into it. "Got someone trying to access the private terminal with suspicious documentation." He emphasized the word suspicious while staring directly at Sarah. Sarah felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. It was probably the hospital in Houston checking on her arrival time. She reached for it, but Webster's voice stopped her. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, placing his hand near his utility belt in an unnecessarily threatening gesture. The terminal had gone completely quiet. The coffee machine's gentle hum seemed unusually loud in the tense silence. Sarah could feel her heart beating faster, but her face remained calm. Years of performing complex surgeries under pressure had taught her to keep her emotions in check. A young black janitor who had been cleaning nearby stopped his work, watching the scene with a mix of anger and resignation on his face. Sarah caught his eye, and they shared a moment of understanding. This was a familiar story to both of them. "Mr. Webster," Sarah began again, her voice steady and clear. "I'm going to reach for my phone very slowly. I need to call a hospital in Houston to let them know about this delay. A 12-year-old boy is waiting for emergency surgery that only I can perform." "Sure he is," Webster scoffed. "And I'm the President of the United States." A few nervous laughs came from somewhere in the crowd, quickly silenced by disapproving looks from others. Sarah pulled out her phone and, making her movements deliberately slow and visible, pressed the record button. She held it up openly, making sure Webster could see what she was doing. "For everyone's protection," she said quietly, "I'm going to record our interaction from this point forward." Webster's face changed when he saw the phone recording. His cockiness faltered slightly, but his stubbornness seemed to grow stronger. "Recording won't change anything," he said. "You're not getting through here without proper authorization." "What would proper authorization look like, Mr. Webster?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet terminal. "Because I provided my medical license, hospital ID, flight confirmation, and surgery documentation. Could you please explain exactly what's missing?" The crowd had grown even larger now. Pilots, flight attendants, other travelers, and airport staff had formed a loose circle around the security checkpoint. Some had their phones out, also recording. Webster started to look less sure of himself, but like many people who find themselves in the wrong, he decided to dig in deeper. The stage was set for what would become a viral moment in the ongoing conversation about racial bias and professionalism. Neither Sarah nor Webster knew it yet, but the next few minutes would change both their lives forever. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still, her phone continuing to record as security guard Webster called for his supervisor. The time on the terminal's large digital clock showed 7:05 a.m. She had exactly 25 minutes until her scheduled departure. "While we wait for your supervisor," Sarah said calmly, "I'd like to note that you haven't actually stated a valid reason for denying me access." Her voice remained professional and controlled, though inside she was thinking about young Tommy Rodriguez lying in his hospital bed in Houston. Webster shifted uncomfortably, aware of the many phones now recording the situation. "Listen, lady," he started, but Sarah politely cut him off. "That's Dr. Mitchell, Mr. Webster. I didn't spend 12 years in medical training to be called lady." She smiled as she said this, but her eyes were serious. "Now, shall we review my credentials again?" A well-dressed woman in the crowd stepped forward. "I'm Patricia Chen, an attorney," she announced. "And I'd be happy to witness this interaction." She stood near Sarah, her presence adding another layer of professional support to the situation. Sarah nodded gratefully at Patricia, then turned back to Webster. "Mr. Webster, let me explain something clearly. Every minute we spend here is a minute delayed for my patient's emergency surgery. I'm sure you wouldn't want to be responsible for delaying life-saving medical care, would you?" Webster's face turned red again. "You're trying to trick me," he insisted, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This is a high-security area. We can't just let anyone walk in claiming to be a doctor." "You're absolutely right about security," Sarah agreed, surprising Webster with her response. "That's why I have multiple forms of identification, including my hospital ID with security chip, my state medical license, and my flight confirmation. Would you like to check the security features on each of them?" The crowd murmured in approval at her handling of the situation. A young security trainee standing nearby looked embarrassed by his senior colleague's behavior. Sarah pulled out her phone again, this time dialing a number. She put it on speaker. "Hello, this is Dr. Harrison, Chief of Staff at Houston Memorial," a voice answered. "Dr. Harrison, this is Sarah Mitchell. I apologize, but I'm being delayed at the Atlanta private terminal due to a security concern. Could you please verify my identity and the emergency nature of today's surgery for the security staff?" Dr. Harrison's authoritative voice filled the quiet terminal. "Of course, this is absolutely unacceptable. We have a 12-year-old patient prepped and waiting. Dr. Mitchell is one of only 3 surgeons in the country qualified to perform this specific procedure. Who do I need to speak with?" Webster stared at the phone, his mouth slightly open. Before he could respond, a tall man in an airport management uniform hurried toward the scene. "I'm Stephen Torres, Terminal Operations Manager," he announced, slightly out of breath. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sarah turned to face him, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Good morning, Mr. Torres. I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, scheduled for a 7:30 charter flight to Houston for emergency surgery. I've been detained here for the past 20 minutes without explanation, despite providing complete documentation." The manager looked at the gathering crowd, the recording phones, and Webster's increasingly uncomfortable expression. He quickly reviewed Sarah's documents. "Dr. Mitchell, I sincerely apologize for this incident," Torres said, shooting a sharp look at Webster. "Please, let me escort you to your flight personally. We'll deal with this situation appropriately." As Sarah gathered her documents, she turned to Webster one last time. "Mr. Webster, I hope this experience helps you understand that professionalism and competence don't have a specific look. Your assumptions could have had serious consequences for my patient today." The crowd parted as Torres led Sarah toward the private jet area. Behind them, Webster stood frozen, his face a mix of embarrassment and defiance. Patricia Chen, the attorney, was already handing her business card to several witnesses. Sarah checked her watch again, 7:15 a.m. She could still make it to Houston on time if the flight left promptly. As she walked through the terminal, several people nodded respectfully or gave her encouraging smiles. She had handled the situation with grace and dignity, turning an ugly moment into a powerful lesson for everyone present. Little did anyone know, this morning's incident would soon become a teaching moment for security staff across the country, all because one doctor chose to respond to discrimination with unwavering professionalism and calm determination. Terminal Operations Manager Torres escorted Dr. Sarah Mitchell toward her waiting private jet, but their path was suddenly blocked by Webster's supervisor, Mark Davidson, who had finally arrived at the scene. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression on his face. "I need to understand exactly what happened here," Davidson said, looking between Sarah and Torres. Behind them, Webster hurried forward, trying to speak first. "Sir, this woman was being uncooperative and—" Webster started, but Davidson held up his hand to stop him. "I've already seen 3 different video recordings from passengers," Davidson interrupted. "Mr. Webster, please return to the break room and wait for me there." His voice was stern, leaving no room for argument. As Webster walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, Sarah noticed several airport employees watching from different corners of the terminal. Some were shaking their heads, while others were typing on their phones. The incident had clearly caught everyone's attention. Dr. Mitchell, Davidson said, turning to face her, "I'm deeply sorry for this incident. Would you be willing to give us a brief statement about what happened? It would help us address this situation properly." Sarah checked her watch. 7:20 a.m. Her flight was scheduled to leave in 10 minutes. "I can give you exactly 5 minutes," she replied professionally. "A young patient is waiting for me in Houston." Davidson quickly pulled out a tablet to record her statement. Sarah spoke clearly and factually, describing Webster's behavior without emotion or exaggeration. She mentioned his refusal to check her credentials properly, his discriminatory tone, and his unnecessary threat when she reached for her phone. While she spoke, Patricia Chen, the attorney who had stepped forward earlier, stood nearby taking notes. "This is a clear case of discrimination," Patricia commented, "and the fact that it delayed an emergency medical procedure makes it even more serious." Other witnesses began stepping forward. A flight attendant named Maria Rodriguez spoke up. "I saw the whole thing. Dr. Mitchell was completely professional while Mr. Webster was aggressive and dismissive from the start." The young security trainee who had watched everything also gave his statement. "I've been training here for 3 weeks," he said nervously. "Mr. Webster has shown similar behavior before, but never this extreme." As more people came forward, Terminal Manager Torres checked his phone and frowned. "Dr. Mitchell, the videos are already spreading on social media. Our PR department is getting calls." Sarah remained focused on her priority. "Mr. Torres, while I appreciate the need to address this situation, I have a 12-year-old patient waiting. We need to get this flight in the air." Davidson nodded quickly. Of course. But one last thing, would you be willing to be part of our staff training program in the future? Your handling of this situation was exemplary." "You can contact me through Atlanta Memorial Hospital," Sarah replied diplomatically. "But right now, Tommy Rodriguez needs his surgery." As if on cue, Sarah's phone rang. It was Tommy's mother in Houston. Sarah answered it while walking toward her flight. "Mrs. Rodriguez, yes, I'm boarding now. There was a small delay, but I'll be there soon. Tommy will be fine." The pilot met them at the jet's entrance. "Dr. Mitchell, we've already filed an updated flight plan. We'll make up the time in the air." Before boarding, Sarah turned to address the small crowd that had followed them. "Thank you all for standing up and speaking out," she said. "Change happens when people choose not to be silent witnesses." Patricia Chen handed Sarah her business card. "I'll follow up on this. We'll make sure it leads to real changes in their security protocols." As Sarah finally settled into her seat on the private jet, she could see Webster being escorted out of the building by security. Through the window, she noticed airport staff gathering around Davidson, likely for an emergency meeting about the incident. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Dr. Mitchell, we're cleared for immediate takeoff. Flight time to Houston will be 2 hours and 5 minutes." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, shifting her mind from what had happened to what lay ahead. A delicate surgery that would save a young boy's life. That was what really mattered. But she also knew that this morning's incident would have lasting effects on how the airport handled security screening and bias training. The jet engines roared to life, and as they took off, Sarah could see the morning sun fully rising over Atlanta. It was the dawn of a new day, and change was in the air. While Dr. Sarah Mitchell performed her life-saving surgery in Houston, videos of her encounter with security guard Webster spread across social media like wildfire. By noon, just hours after the incident, millions of people had watched the footage captured by various passengers. In the main terminal break room, Janet Williams, a veteran flight attendant, showed the viral video to her colleagues on her tablet. "Look at how calm she stayed," Janet said to the group gathered around her. "And this woman is literally one of the top brain surgeons in the country." The comment section under the main video was filled with thousands of responses. "Dr. Mitchell showed us how to handle racism with pure class. This is what real strength looks like. That security guard picked the wrong person to mess with." Back at Atlanta International Airport, the management team was in crisis mode. The airport's phones were ringing non-stop with calls from news stations, civil rights organizations, and angry citizens. The story had caught fire because of how clearly it showed discrimination in action, and how professionally Dr. Mitchell had handled it. Webster sat alone in the Human Resources office, watching his own face on the TV mounted on the wall. Every major news channel was playing the footage. His rude behavior and biased assumptions were being broadcast nationwide. The security guard's face had grown pale as he realized the magnitude of his actions. "Your actions today have brought shame to this airport," his supervisor, Davidson, told him. "We've received complaints about your behavior before, but nothing this serious." Davidson placed a letter on the desk. "This is your termination notice. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination." Meanwhile, in the airport's main conference room, Terminal Manager Torres led an emergency meeting with all security staff. "What happened this morning is completely unacceptable," he announced to the room full of employees. "But we're going to use this as a learning opportunity." He played the video again, but this time focused on Dr. Mitchell's response. Notice how she remained professional throughout the entire incident. She presented her credentials calmly, recorded the interaction for documentation, and maintained her composure despite clear discrimination. Patricia Chen, the attorney who had witnessed the incident, was already preparing legal documents. Her office had received calls from various civil rights organizations wanting to ensure this incident led to real change in airport security protocols. At Houston Memorial Hospital, unaware of how viral her story had become, Dr. Mitchell was focused entirely on young Tommy Rodriguez's surgery. Her skilled hands worked with precision as she removed the dangerous tumor from the boy's brain. The operating room staff had heard about the morning's incident but remained professional, focusing on supporting the crucial surgery. Back in Atlanta, the airport's PR team crafted a public statement. Atlanta International Airport deeply regrets the discriminatory treatment experienced by Dr. Sarah Mitchell this morning. The employee involved has been terminated, and we are implementing immediate changes to our security training protocols. We are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with respect and dignity. By late afternoon, several major airlines had reached out to the airport, expressing concern about the incident and demanding assurance that their passengers wouldn't face similar discrimination. The airport CEO had to cut short his vacation to address the growing crisis. The young security trainee who had witnessed everything was interviewed by the airport's internal affairs department. "I knew something was wrong when I saw how Mr. Webster was treating her," he said. "Dr. Mitchell taught us all a lesson in professionalism today." Social media continued to buzz with the story. #DoctorsMatter and #StopAirportracism became trending topics. People shared their own stories of facing discrimination at security checkpoints, but many also praised Dr. Mitchell's approach to handling the situation. A group of Black medical professionals started an online campaign celebrating Dr. Mitchell's composure and success. "This is what a doctor looks like: all colors, all backgrounds, all worthy of respect." By evening, major civil rights organizations had contacted the airport, demanding a complete overhaul of their security training procedures. They wanted to use the incident as a case study in how subtle and not so subtle discrimination appears in everyday situations. The day was ending, but the impact of the morning's events was just beginning. Dr. Mitchell's composed response to discrimination had sparked a national conversation about professionalism, racism, and the power of maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice. At Houston Memorial Hospital, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the operating room after 6 intense hours of surgery. She removed her surgical cap and smiled. Tommy Rodriguez's tumor had been successfully removed. She was completely unaware that she had become an internet sensation while saving the young boy's life. "Dr. Mitchell." Tommy's parents rushed toward her as she entered the waiting area. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes were filled with tears of hope. "How is our son?" "The surgery was successful," Sarah said warmly. "We removed the entire tumor. Tommy should make a full recovery." The parents hugged each other, then hugged Sarah, their relief and joy obvious to everyone in the waiting room. As Sarah walked to her temporary office to write up her surgical notes, her phone buzzed constantly. She had turned it off during surgery, and now hundreds of notifications flooded in. There were missed calls from news stations, messages from colleagues, and countless social media alerts. "Dr. Mitchell?" A nurse knocked on her office door. "You might want to see this." She handed Sarah an iPad open to a news website. The headline read, Prestigious neurosurgeon faces discrimination at Atlanta airport. Shows remarkable grace under pressure. Sarah watched the videos of her morning confrontation with Webster for the first time. The footage showed multiple angles of the incident, captured by different passengers. She saw herself staying calm and professional, while Webster grew increasingly aggressive. "Your story is everywhere," the nurse said excitedly. "You're trending on social media. People are calling you a role model for handling discrimination with such dignity." Just then, Sarah's phone rang. It was her mother. "Baby, are you okay?" her mom asked, concern in her voice. "I just saw the videos. Your father and I are so proud of how you handled yourself." "I'm fine, Mom," Sarah assured her. "More importantly, my patient is going to be okay. That's what really matters." As she talked with her mother, Sarah checked her email. There were interview requests from major TV networks, speaking invitations from medical conferences, and even a message from the governor's office commending her professionalism. The hospital's PR team knocked on her door next. "Dr. Mitchell, there are reporters outside wanting to talk to you. How would you like to handle this?" Sarah thought for a moment. "Tell them I'll give one brief statement after I check on my patient. Tommy and his recovery are my priority right now." Walking to the pediatric ICU, Sarah passed several hospital staff members who nodded in respect or gave her encouraging smiles. Some held up their phones, showing her the viral videos of her encounter. In Tommy's room, the young boy was just waking up from anesthesia. His parents sat beside him, holding his hands. When they saw Sarah, their faces lit up with gratitude. "Dr. Mitchell," Mr. Rodriguez said, "we saw what happened at the airport this morning. We can't believe you still made it here on time to save our son after being treated so badly." Sarah checked Tommy's vital signs while responding. "There was never any question about making it here. Your son needed me, and that's what mattered most." Tommy stirred and slowly opened his eyes. "Did it work?" he asked weakly. "Is the tumor gone?" "Yes, Tommy," Sarah smiled, checking his pupils with a small light. "The surgery was perfect. You're going to be just fine." As she left Tommy's room, Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was Patricia Chin, the attorney from the airport. "Dr. Mitchell, your story has sparked a national conversation about discrimination in professional settings. Would you be willing to help us create new training programs?" Sarah thought about the young security trainee who had witnessed everything, about Webster's shocked face when he realized his mistake, and about all the people who might face similar situations in the future. "Yes," she replied. "But first, I need to focus on my patient's recovery. We can talk next week about making positive changes." Looking out the hospital window at the Houston skyline, Sarah reflected on how this day had unfolded. What started as an ugly encounter with prejudice had transformed into an opportunity for positive change. But right now, her biggest victory wasn't becoming a viral sensation. It was the young boy recovering in the room behind her, with his whole life ahead of him. Sometimes, she thought, the best response to discrimination isn't just staying calm, it's staying focused on what truly matters. 1 month after the incident at Atlanta International Airport, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a packed conference room. She was there to help launch the airport's new anti-discrimination training program, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was Tommy Rodriguez, now fully recovered from his surgery. "This is what was at stake that morning," Sarah said, gesturing to Tommy, who smiled brightly at the crowd. "While Mr. Webster was busy judging me by my appearance, this young man was waiting for life-saving surgery." The audience, made up of airport security staff from across the country, listened intently. Among them was James Webster himself, who had requested to attend after completing a mandatory diversity awareness course. He sat in the back row, his face showing genuine regret. Dr. Mitchell, a young security officer, raised her hand. "How did you stay so calm that day? I would have been so angry." Sarah smiled thoughtfully before answering. "I've faced discrimination many times in my career, but I learned early on that losing my temper wouldn't change minds. My calmness that day wasn't weakness, it was strength." Tommy stepped forward to the microphone. "Dr. Mitchell didn't let anything stop her from saving my life," he said confidently. "She's my hero, and not just because she removed my tumor. She showed me how to stand up to bullies without becoming one." The room burst into applause. In the months since the incident, the video had been viewed over 50 million times. It was now being used in training sessions at airports, hospitals, and businesses across the country. Patricia Chen, the attorney who witnessed the original incident, presented the new security protocols she had helped develop. "We've created clear guidelines to prevent discrimination while maintaining proper security measures," she explained. And it all started because Dr. Mitchell chose to record that interaction. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message from the talk show wanting to book her as a guest. She had turned down most media appearances, preferring to focus on her work and speaking at professional training sessions like this one. During the lunch break, Webster approached Sarah nervously. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I've wanted to apologize properly for weeks. I was wrong, and my actions that day showed the worst of who I was. Thank you for helping me learn to be better." Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. "Mr. Webster, the goal was never to punish you. It was to create change. I'm glad you're here today, learning and growing." She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, he shook it. The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Security staff role-played different situations, learning to check credentials properly without making assumptions. Sarah watched as they practiced maintaining professionalism while ensuring safety. Tommy and his parents sat in the audience, watching everything. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned over to Sarah and whispered, "You didn't just save our son's life, you're helping save others from experiencing what you went through." Later that day, Sarah received an email from the airport's CEO. They wanted to name their new training center after her, the Mitchell Center for Professional Excellence and Equal Treatment. Sarah smiled as she read it, remembering her father's words about dignity being the best response to discrimination. The young security trainee who had witnessed the original incident was now helping lead some training sessions. "Dr. Mitchell taught us that true security comes from treating everyone with respect while following proper procedures," he told his group. At the end of the day, as people were leaving, an elderly black janitor approached Sarah. "I saw what happened that morning," he said quietly. "Been working here 30 years, seen lots of things like that. But what you did, it's making real change happen." Sarah drove home that evening feeling satisfied. The incident that could have been just another ugly example of discrimination had instead become a catalyst for positive change. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from a young black girl who wanted to become a doctor. "Dear Dr. Mitchell," the message read, "I saw your video and now I know that nothing can stop me if I stay strong and calm like you did. Thank you for showing me what's possible." Sarah smiled as she typed a response. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the hardest moments. And sometimes, staying calm in the face of discrimination isn't just about dignity, it's about showing others the way forward. 6 months after the incident at Atlanta International Airport, Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat in her office at Atlanta Memorial Hospital, looking at a wall of thank you cards. They weren't just from her patients. Many were from people inspired by how she handled discrimination that morning. The door opened, and Tommy Rodriguez walked in with his parents for his final checkup. The 12-year-old boy was completely healthy now, back to playing baseball and getting good grades in school. He wore a t-shirt that read, "Kindness wins." "Dr. Mitchell, guess what?" Tommy said excitedly. "I got an A+ on my presentation about you. I told my whole class about how you helped change the airport's rules and saved my life on the same day." Sarah smiled warmly. "That's wonderful, Tommy. But remember what we talked about. The goal isn't to be famous. It's about making things better for everyone." After Tommy's checkup showed perfect results, Sarah checked her schedule. She had a meeting at the airport's Mitchell Center for Professional Excellence, the training facility named in her honor. The center had already trained over 1,000 security staff from airports across the country. As she drove to the airport, Sarah thought about all the changes that had happened. The viral video of her encounter with Webster had now reached 100 million views. It was being used in schools, businesses, and government agencies as an example of how to handle discrimination professionally. Walking through the same terminal where everything happened, Sarah noticed the differences. New signs clearly listed passenger rights. Security staff wore body cameras. Most importantly, the atmosphere felt more respectful and professional. James Webster, the former security guard, had transformed his life too. After completing extensive training, he now worked with civil rights organizations, sharing his story as a warning about the dangers of prejudice. He had written Sarah a long letter of apology, which she kept in her office as a reminder that people can change. Inside the training center, Sarah found Patricia Chen teaching a class. The attorney had helped create new security guidelines that were being adopted by airports nationwide. On the wall was a large photo from that morning, showing Sarah calmly presenting her credentials while Webster looked aggressive. "Dr. Mitchell is here," Patricia announced to the class. "She's the reason this center exists." Her response to discrimination that morning showed us all how to turn a negative situation into positive change. A young black woman in a security uniform raised her hand. "Dr. Mitchell, I got this job because of you. When I saw your video, I realized security work needed more people who understand the importance of respect and fairness." During lunch, Sarah received an email from Harvard Medical School. They wanted her to give a speech about maintaining professionalism in difficult situations. It would be her 100th invitation to speak, but she still carefully chose which events to attend. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Look at the news, baby." She opened a news app to find that Congress had just passed the Mitchell Act, a new law requiring anti-discrimination training for all transportation security personnel nationwide. Later that afternoon, Sarah visited the airport's memorial wall, where a new plaque had been installed. It read, "On this spot, dignity overcame discrimination." Dr. Sarah Mitchell showed us that true strength lies not in aggressive power, but in calm determination to do what's right. As she stood reading the plaque, a group of young medical students on their way to a conference recognized her. "Dr. Mitchell, your story inspired all of us to stand up for ourselves while staying professional. Can we take a picture with you?" Sarah agreed to the photo, remembering how far things had come. The incident that could have been just another sad story of discrimination had instead sparked real change. Airports across the world were adopting the Mitchell Protocol for security screening. That evening, as Sarah finished her hospital rounds, she received one final surprise. A letter arrived from a 10-year-old girl in Kansas. "Dear Dr. Mitchell, in school we learned about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and now you. Thank you for showing us that we can still change the world by staying calm and being strong." Sarah pinned the letter to her wall, next to Tommy's latest baseball photo and the airport's new security guidelines. Sometimes the biggest changes start with one person choosing dignity over anger, professionalism over retaliation, and courage over fear. The security guard who tried to block her that morning had instead helped her open new doors for countless others. And that, Sarah thought, was the greatest victory of all.